Well, welcome to the Janelle King Show. I am Janelle King, and this is Extra 106.3. And this is where we discuss kitchen table topics that are typically banned from family gatherings, but are absolutely necessary in order to have a strong republic. What are we talking about today? Oh, man, we're so overdue from having this conversation. If you have not been around what's happening, if you haven't seen what's happening as it relates to Georgia elections, then you are living under a rock, honey. And so, but I haven't spoken in depth. I've spoken to county, parties. I've spoken to the media. I've spoken at our board meetings. But I just haven't really started talking about things in depth. And oftentimes what you're going to hear is snippets of responses, snippets of understanding, snippets of what's thought to be happening, a lot of editing. And so when you're in that type of situation, I'm noticing that it's leading to a misleading of the public. I think there are a lot of people that are really confused about what's really going on as it relates to Georgia elections. So we are going to talk about it all right here. So grab your tea, get comfortable. As you can see, for those of you who are watching me on YouTube, I am on my sofa. I am comfortable because we're going to talk. And I'm excited about having this conversation, particularly with you all, because I believe that the more we empower the people, the more we empower voters, I just think the better off we're all going to be, because we live in a representative republic. We do not live in a democracy. And I think when you start confusing a democracy with a representative republic, certain things start to look a little bizarre. People get confused. People feel like they have more of a voice than they do. And in fact, our forefathers didn't want that to be the case. He didn't want mob rule. They didn't want majority rule. What they wanted was for the people to decide who will make the best representative, who would be the best representative to go and speak on behalf of the people, not on behalf of the majority, but on behalf of all the people. And this is perfect, because if it was a majority rule situation, using Georgia as an example, then our larger counties would have way more control and power than our smaller counties. Our larger congressional districts are more populous areas. So ensuring that we maintain that we are a representative republic is step one when understanding how we're going to manage elections. So in order to kickstart this conversation, we got to do some foundational things. We've got to talk about, how did we get here? Where did this come from? Was President Trump the first candidate to complain about his election results? This is where we have to start, because if we don't, then we're going to find ourselves in a situation where we are really confused about what's happening. And I think this plays a major role in why there are so many people that are confused about what's happening. So how did we get here? So for those of you who are way too young to remember the hanging Chad, we'll talk about that in a second. For most of us, we will say that this election process, or this discussion around election integrity, started somewhere around 2016, where we saw Hillary Clinton state that she felt as though the election was rigged and that the election was stolen. And she made the first set of claims against the election process that I can remember. And I will venture to say many people who are watching or listening can remember. Now, like I said, there are those who remember the hanging Chad, but that took place in Florida. So for the sake of time, I'm going to stay focused on Georgia. So we're not going to go that far back. However, I did like to mention that 2016 was kind of where everything kind of started. And that's because Hillary Clinton was like, no, I don't think I lost, so forth and so forth. Well, at that time, the Democrats were the ones who were the election deniers, not Republicans. And then you fast forward to 2018 and here in Georgia, and we saw that Stacey Abrams, who ran for governor in 2018, made some claims as well. She also refused to concede on election night, because she had concerns about the outcome and the results of the election. So then in same year, 2018, we saw Sarah Amico Riggs, who ran against Jeff Duncan, who was our current lieutenant governor, but she ran to be lieutenant governor, and she also had some claims as well. Then you fast forward to 2020. And in 2020, that's when this became a lot. I think I would say that's when the lid came off, because now we didn't have a presidential candidate like in 2016 who was a Democrat and was able to kind of be sheltered through all of the attacks and all of that stuff. You didn't have a gubernatorial candidate or a governor candidate and a lieutenant governor candidate, which was more on the local level here in the state. You now have a very vocal, very aggressive Republican presidential candidate who was not just a presidential candidate, but was the actual sitting president at the time, now claiming that there was something wrong with our elections. So I would like to start there by saying that I believe that's where it started as it relates to, the uproar becoming more of a national conversation. It was when our sitting president had concerns about the outcome of his election. And when you're talking about vacating the White House, yeah, there was a lot of questions around what's happening, what's going on, and whether or not the process of our election process is working. Thank you so much for joining the show. Please remember to like, share, comment, and subscribe. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you'll be notified every time I upload new content. Now back to the discussion. So moving on, the next topic that I want to touch on before we go into the specifics of the rules that were recently passed here in Georgia is, are rules necessary? What is our board necessary? Well, absolutely. I like to try to explain it like this. Our Secretary of State's office is that he represents our elections altogether. The Secretary of State is the chief election officer. So that means that he is responsible for making sure our elections are ran and that they go off without any issues, and that everyone can trust the results. The State Elections Board monitors the process to ensure that we have steps in place that will secure our elections, keep fraud out, but most importantly, ensure the accuracy of our elections. So the rules that we pass are not legislative. We're not creating policy, because our rules have to operate within policy, within the governmental process. So what we're seeing is people are a little convoluted and a little confused about whether or not the State Election Board is taking on the role of the legislators. No, not at all. We had a rule come before us that would switch the voting experience and the voting process from voting on the machine to voting by paper. So introducing paper ballots again, and people will come in, they'll check off or write or fill out whatever their Scantron, which is what happened in Florida with the hanging Chad, and fill out their Scantrons or whatever, and then we move on. Now, we voted against that, not because there was a disagreement in the rule, but because the rule was going to fundamentally change how the election process works. Now, that is the responsibility of the legislators. That's not the responsibility of the state election board. So therefore, we absolutely made a decision not to support that because we did not want to overstep our boundaries. So understanding the role of the election board, the state election board, is extremely important when you are considering whether or not you are supportive or in opposition of the rules that are being passed. Our job is to make sure that the process, the election process, is that there are rules in place to ensure that the election process is being followed, the process that is set by the legislators. Okay. That being said, let's talk about why you know what this board is, because the state election board has been around for a very, very long time. It wasn't until after the 2020 elections in 2021 when the legislative session started and our representatives decided that they wanted to separate the state election board from the Secretary of State. So prior to the board being independent on its own, the board was pretty much ran by the Secretary of State. So that would mean that the Secretary of State was the chairman of our board, and he had a lot of power over the board. And there were people who felt like that was the kind of like the fox guarding the hen house, right? How is it that the person who is ensuring that rules are followed in the election process is also the person who's responsible for running the election process? So a lot of people felt like that was a little confusing. So they decided to separate. Now, there's two bills that you have to pay attention to. One is the one you've probably heard a lot about, and that's SB 202. SB 202 was the bill that decided to remove the state election board from underneath the Secretary of State's office so that now the state election board can operate independently versus being managed and controlled by the Secretary of State's office. But then there's SB 189. SB 189 was a bill that was passed in order to remove the chairman or the Secretary of State from being the chairman of the board. So without SB 189, you would have a separation where you now have the Secretary of State that is on one side and then the state election board on another side. However, the problem with that is that you will also find yourself running into a situation where you now have a separation, but the chairman of the state election board would happen to be the chair or the secretary and the chief officer of the Secretary of State. He is the Secretary of State. So they needed both bills in order to create a complete independent separation. So now that we've talked about how we got here, we talked about what we do in the role of the state election board. We talked about the bills that were passed that gave the state election board the power to be separate and independent of the Secretary of State's office. So the rules that come before the state election board are proposed mostly by election officials and the public. The state election board does not come up with these rules. Can we? Absolutely, but we haven't. I see a series of petitions and proposals that come before us, and we have to review them. Typically, an amendment to a current rule is what's creating these proposals. So in other words, oftentimes we'll see election officials who will have a rule in mind that they think should be a little more detailed, better explained, or modified and amended altogether. So a lot of these rules are not brand new. They are a modification of our current rules, which fits exactly what we are supposed to be doing. Our rules have to be supported by our Georgia Code. So if you happen to be at a board meeting, you may see me pull up this, which is our Georgia Election Code book. And I've tabbed it so that I can kind of get to the areas that I need to get to quickly. But you may see this come up a lot. And this is our Georgia Code book. So when rules are put before us, we reference the Georgia Code just to make sure that we are not overstepping our boundaries and that we are following the correct policies and procedures. Every proposal that comes before us has a purpose, a main feature, and implementation. The purpose typically entails why an individual is bringing this before us. And oftentimes they'll give us examples of how this rule didn't work in the past or how it created some confusion. So then they'll go into the main feature, which is explaining what the adjustments will be, what the amendment is, what this proposal is actually hoping to do. And then implementation. How do we implement it? So for instance, when we have certain rules, the how do you go about doing it? That is the implementation process. So just as a recap, every rule is proposed to us in the form of a petition. It mostly comes from election officials or those who are highly involved in the election process. They typically are amendments or type of adjustments to the current rules that are on the books in order to make it a better rule or make it more understandable or just more secure. It has to be supported by the Georgia Code my Georgia Code book. And they typically come with a purpose, a main feature, and implementation. Now, what is my thought process? By the time I get these rules, I go through a very in-depth thought process. It takes me a couple of days to review everything and to really make sure that I fully understand. So I love that we typically get our agenda about a week in advance so that we have time to do our necessary research. So the first thing I think about is this necessary? Is this rule that's before me? What is the necessity of it? And what is the purpose of it? So I go straight there to ensure that I understand why this rule is being proposed. Next, I look at the proposed adjustment, whether or not that adjustment is going to alter or change things in a huge way. Then I think about, is it within our purview? Is it something that we can do? Is this rule now legislating rather than us just kind of making these adjustments and making sure that we are following our Georgia Code and making sure that we're not legislating? So I always think about that. Then I think about, who will it impact? Will it change the experience of the voter? And do we have enough time to make that type of adjustment? Well, ultimately, the changing to the experience of the voter, there are no rules that we've passed that would change the experience of the voter at all. Those who will be impacted will be those who are working elections in the election process. So at that stage, I realize, okay, I can move forward. Then I think about, what is the return? Is the return greater or at least worth the effort? If you're asking me to do something and it seems like it's going to cause a lot of controversy, a lot of confusion, but the outcome, the return is not as good, then sometimes I'm thinking maybe this is not a good idea for right now. We need to ensure that the outcome would be much better. So I think about that. I also think about, will it increase cost? And who will be responsible for that cost? I am very particular. If you watch some of the board meetings, I'm very particular about whether or not we are making adjustments to the county's budgets. As a businesswoman, and my husband and I own a business, we understand the responsibility that lies on you as an owner and on you who is responsible for a budget to ensure that you have that budget in place ahead of time. So if I feel like these decisions are going to negatively impact a budget, that'll be a problem. There was a rule that came before us that would require the counties to have to pay for something. And even though their argument was that the amount was very minute, very minimal, as a businesswoman, I could not support that, because no matter, every dollar is typically allocated in your budget. And when I think about these counties already having put their budget together, I wouldn't dare cause them to have to adjust that adjust their budget at the last minute, because that's a problem, right? You now have to pull from other places and it just becomes a whole thing. Another thing I think about is, will this prolong the outcome and how much? And when the rules that we're going to talk about, none of them will prolong the outcome of the election. However, it may prolong a little bit the process in which we have to go through during that certification week. But it does not change certification. It will not change anything that the voters will see in most cases. And if we do it right and we follow the rules, that will be the case. So now that you know my thought process, now that you know how these rules come before us, how they're proposed, why the uproar, right? Why are there so many articles, so many people opposing us on both sides of the aisle? Why? Well, the first thing I always say is that there are people who benefit from the chaos, and how they do that, that's not up to me. I don't know. I'm not in their personal business, but I do know that it's possible to benefit from chaos. A lot of people talks about crisis and chaos being the crisis. And so I think you have to keep that in mind. You also have to keep in mind that there's always going to be a winner and a loser. So whenever we're starting to make adjustments to the election process, there are people who have upcoming elections. There are people who would like to run for office. There are people who are involved in the election process who doesn't want to be the loser. And so there's a nervousness that if we secure it too much, or if we do this, that it will somehow impact the outcome of their race, and then they become protective. So I know that happens. And there are people who feel like if you're the one who won, like, let's go back to 2016. In 2016, when Hillary Clinton was complaining about the election process, as Republicans, we were extremely quiet. You know why? Because we were the winner. And if it's not broke, don't fix it, right? So there wasn't an uprising of Republicans in 2016 because we won. But with losers, they always want to make all the changes. We have a current board member right now who's a Democrat who argued against getting rid of the Dominion machine and came before this very board prior to becoming a board member. So you have to ask yourself, what side of the aisle, and I don't mean Republican or Democrat, but whether you're the winner or the loser when it comes to the chaos. So that's always something to keep in mind. Another reason why I think there's a huge uprising and uproar is because there's a lack of understanding of the rules, which is why I'm going to go in depth on the two rules that are getting the most attention, because a lack of understanding will cause you to perish. It will cause you to be completely behind. It will cause you to be saying things on social media that doesn't make any sense. The number of comments that I get and I read that comes from people who are being really mean and nasty, but I can't even take it personally, because all I can see is the lack of understanding that's in those comments. So I don't see the personal attacks. I do see the misleading of the public when we're not giving them the full story. And that's what makes me a little upset. And the most obvious reason why I think there's an uproar happening right now is because this is an election year, because it's a presidential election year. And I happen to believe that the state election board, we're just a casualty of war, right? I mean, a lot of the people who are opposing us are more liberal outlets. There are Republicans, obviously, but in most cases, it feels like it's a much more of a liberal attack on us, because there's an assumption that the Republican board members are working and colluding with the president and all this stuff that it's just so bizarre and weird to me. But needless to say, it's what they believe. So you have a situation where we just became casualty of war during the election year. And it's fine. I've been here before several times. I've been in politics for a very long time. I think it's important to state that while I have not ran elections, because I'm not the Secretary of State, but I have been a part of the election process for a long time. I have helped candidates get across that finish line several times, from interning, door knocking, to assisting with strategy. So I know enough about the election process to know that it has to be ran correctly and that it needs to be accurate in order for people to trust it. So let's get into the election rules really quickly so that we can manage our time properly. The first election rule that has gotten so much heat, that was the very first one that everyone was so up in arms about. And unfortunately, it is still being talked about like right now. And that is the reasonable inquiry rule. It's 183-1-1-0.01. If you want the code, I guess you can say what the code is going to be. But I call it the reasonable inquiry rule. And the purpose of this rule, and I'm going to read it directly from the proposal. The purpose of this rule is to allow county superintendents and board members to exercise their authority to oversee the conduct of elections. Now, let's be clear. The county board members are supposed to be responsible for overseeing the conduct of our elections, not the outcome, but overseeing the process to make sure that our elections are being ran effectively. And their role is to do that on a county level. Every county has precincts. So when you go into the polling booth and you walk in there to go vote, you're walking into a precinct. You're not walking into the county board election office, just a precinct, a polling place. So there are boards that are responsible for ensuring that all of those precincts are operating correctly. Now, the main feature of this particular reasonable inquiry rule is that it was to allow the superintendents and the board members. Why do we have two? Because in smaller counties where there's not a lot of people, sometimes they'll have superintendents rather than having a full board. But whether you're the superintendent or you're part of the county board, the main feature of this rule was to allow you to conduct a reasonable inquiry during the certification period. Georgia Code 21-2-70 says that they are to inspect systematically and thoroughly. That is what the Georgia Code says that county board members have the responsibility of doing when it comes to certifying an election. So this rule is literally aiding our county board members and superintendents in order to allow them to conduct their very basic responsibility in that role. So the next question I get oftentimes when it comes to this particular rule is, what do we mean by reasonable? Like, what is reasonable? Well, the definition of reasonable is as much as is appropriate or fair, moderate. That's what's considered to be reasonable. So the role of our officials is to ensure that the election process goes well. The comparison of the number of voters to the number of ballots assists with that. The goal is not to dispute the outcomes. It's to look for discrepancies or to ensure that there aren't any discrepancies. It says that the whole purpose of this rule is to ensure that our county officials feel confident signing their legal affidavits. Let's talk about that. When it's time to certify, they have a certification form. And on that certification form, it says that the election that they just oversaw was accurate, perfect, and free of fraud. So you're not just certifying results. You're also certifying that your county did not do anything wrong when it comes to the election process. So if we're gonna force our county officials as well as our board members to, our superintendents to sign this legal affidavit that is punishable with a felony if they're wrong, if they're incorrect in what they are agreeing to, then it's the least we can do is allow them to do what the Georgia Code says they're supposed to do: inspect systematically and thoroughly. Now, another big question around this whole topic is whether or not it would impact certification. Well, we saw in previous elections that there were board members who did not feel confident certifying. As a result, many of the public didn't see or hear or know what was going on because it's a board. So the majority went on and certified, but they set it out. And that's their right. You can certify or not certify. You're signing a legal document. However, our rule specifically says such returns shall be certified by the super not later than 5 p.m. on the Monday following the date on which such election was held, and such returns shall be immediately transmitted to the SOS, or the Secretary of State. That's what it says in the rule. So you have to ask yourself, why was there such a huge conversation around whether or not we would impact certification when the rule itself states that this reasonable inquiry must take place during the certification period, meaning you can't uphold the certification process. Moving on. The next rule is our hand count rule, which is the most recent rule that we passed, which is also called our tabulating of results rule. Thank you so much for joining the show. Please remember to like, share, comment, and subscribe. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you'll be notified every time I upload new content. Now back to the discussion. This is 183-1-12-.12. The purpose of this rule is to reconcile tabulator tape ballot counts with scanner ballot counts to ensure that the voting system is correctly counting ballots and detect potential errors. Well, there's a situation going on, I believe it's in Tennessee, where they are right now struggling because their machine, their scanner miscounted or didn't count, and it was just some other stuff, right? So the main feature, the main purpose of this rule is to ensure that the number of people who walked into the precinct, the polling place, matches the number of ballots that they have in the scanner. Just that simple. Let me give you an example of how those numbers can be off. There was a gentleman who walked into a polling place and he checked in at the poll pad. So that meant that he checked in as a voter. I voted today. He goes, he gets his card, he puts it in the machine, he votes, he gets his printout. So now he has his paper ballot. It's not until you put into the scanner that it's actually counted. However, his presence was counted, but his ballot is in his hand. So what happens? He wants to take a picture of his ballot because he's a little unsure of the election process. He's told you cannot do that, which you cannot, do not do that. It's against the law. However, he gets upset and he walks out with his ballot. So now the number of ballots in that scanner is not going to match the number of voters who walked into that building. However, on a precinct level, you can explain why this is the case, even down to the actual voter. So this is necessary. Oh, here's another reason. I had several county election board members tell me that it was not uncommon for them to obtain a scanner for an upcoming election and to find ballots in that scanner from a previous election. Why is this a problem? Because what we saw in 2020 in previous elections was several audits, right, where they were recounting the ballots. Well, if there is a case where you have to do a recount, what happens if your scanner is saying that there were 500 people who came and voted here, but then you have 499 ballots? What happens? What happens if that ballot is stuck in a scanner somewhere in a warehouse? I mean, it creates a lot of chaos and mistrust. And how do you explain that to the public? So by ensuring that we are not just pulling ballots out of the scanner and throwing it into a bag and shipping it off, but we're stacking them. They don't have to be in a certain order, but just stack them up and take your finger and count the tips of the paper just to make in groups of 50. And then another person does it, and the last person does it, just to make sure that you have the accurate amount of ballots. We're literally simply counting paper. We're not tabulating. It's important to note that. The tabulating process is what determines what's on the ballots, the results of the election. We are simply putting a rule in place to count the paper. The reason why I didn't support counting paper on during the early voting process each time they dumped those scanners is because I felt like it puts people in a really weird position where they're now flipping through the papers 13, 14 days before the election day. You can kind of, it's tempting, right, to look at what's on the paper. Matter of fact, there was someone who came and spoke in opposition of this rule who mentioned that the writing on the paper was too small. Well, clearly that person was confused. And these are election officials, but they were confused about what you're supposed to be doing. You were not tabulating. You were simply counting the paper. So you should not be reading what's on the paper. Well, doing it on election night after the polls close is a much safer, I would say, socially, it's better because you don't have to have people, talking to their family members and just really harmless, but not realizing that it could cause a lot of harm by sharing what you're seeing in your precinct. It's also important to note that this rule is election day only. It's election day only. So that would mean that we are simply counting ballots on election day. What we found when we looked at the number of ballots, we pulled a election year, a presidential year, and we looked at the number of people who came in and voted at that precinct on election day. On average, we were talking about 300 voters. At the most, we saw 1,400 or 1,700, but something like that, and 1,700. And then it dropped down to about 750, the 500, and then it kept going like 250 and so forth. So what we saw was for those who has a scanner that has more than 750 ballots, we consider the fact that the election workers have been there all day. So we decided to not have them count those by hand on election night, but give them the option of counting them on election night or counting them the very next day at the election office, as long as it's before an audit and is within the certification week. So ultimately, this rule was very simple. It's not going to cause major issues or backups and all that other stuff, but really it is going to create a best practice, because what we found is that there are precincts that are already doing this. So I felt like if there's other precincts that are already doing it, if it's not going to impact the results, and that it will ensure that we are not having county officials tell us that they're getting scanners with previous ballots in them, then we need to pass it. So my original thought process coming into this was that I was going to just be looking at things that would pertain to future elections, and that it wouldn't be as complicated. I'm gonna be honest. I thought that was the original process. I knew we weren't making laws, so I didn't think it would be that complicated. I sit on the State Board of Corrections. We have great board meetings. I'm very involved in that process as well. So I thought it would be similar to that. That was my original thought process. I've never considered myself to be election denier and all that craziness. I don't consider myself to be MAGA at all. I don't even know what that is. If I am MAGA, I'm Reagan MAGA. But either way, I'm a Republican. I've always considered myself to be a Republican. I don't pay attention to people as much as I pay attention to their platforms. So that's always been my thought process. I absolutely as someone that was felt like we needed to move on. I understand that there are people who feel like the election in 2020 was stolen. I don't know if that was the case. I don't feel that. However, I do believe that the process was broken, and I think it has been broken for a long time. So we needed to adjust that and make sure that we make some minor tweaks in order to ensure our process is correct. But I'm not one of those people who were, who think that, the election was stolen. I just not. And that being said, that was my original thought process. The game change that came on that helped, or the game changing moment, I should say, was our very first board meeting. When I came to the board and I had my first board meeting on July 9th of 2024, I was rushed into an executive session within the first 10 minutes of the board meeting starting. And I thought it was the most ridiculous action that took place. So that immediately made me a little more cautious, a little more suspicious of what's happening here, because it felt a little bizarre. Not to mention, we ended that meeting abruptly at 5 p.m. rather than continuing on until we finished the agenda. And then we were slated to have a meeting the very next morning, which I was not made aware of until that moment. So when it turns out that 3 of us were not able to meet in person, the meeting was somehow canceled. I don't agree with that, because we were all there virtually, but we were told that he decided to cancel the meeting. That being said, we now have an open meeting. We have made several decisions. We have passed several rules. We are at least sent several things into rulemaking, and the rulemaking process requires that it's out on the street for 30 days. So that means if we decide that we would like to initiate the rulemaking process, then that means we got to kick it to the public. You all get to see it for 30 days. The legislators' attorneys get to see it. The Secretary of State's attorneys get to see it. The AG, our attorney, gets to see it. Everyone reviews it. They come back to us with their challenges, their opposition, as well as their pros. And then we vote again to determine whether or not we're going to actually make it a rule. So we'd already done a lot of that in that previous meeting. And now we have this open meeting. We don't know when we're going to be able to meet again. We have people telling us that it's possible that it's going to affect the decisions that we made. We're so close to the election. So the majority of us decided to hold a meeting on July 12th so that we can just adjourn the meeting that was left open. So it's like we were in a long recess. And in that adjournment, we actually pushed the controversial rules. We tabled it to the next board meeting because we knew that the entire board was not able to be there. However, that turned into a craziness around illegal meetings and all that other stuff. By the way, the case got dismissed. But either way, it turned into all this craziness around it. And that was a game-changing moment for me. For me, it wasn't the opposition as much as it was how they opposed. It was the response that made me a lot more I don't know, it just made me a little apprehensive of like what was happening. And I felt like the response was more adversarial and not supportive. Another thing I learned is that, people don't like change. And I get that. Change is uncomfortable for a lot of people. Adjustment is uncomfortable for a lot of people. As I stated before, my husband and I are business owners, and we have a whole staff. We have 24 employees. And so we're talking to a lot of different people. A lot of people have a lot of different ideas. A lot of people have a lot of different perspectives on how they think things should be ran. However, there is a vision, but there's also a process that's in place. And so we have to follow the process. And whenever we make adjustments to that process, it is a bit uncomfortable. It is a bit of a growing period or growing pains that you feel while you're going through that. So I understand that adjusting is uncomfortable. Something else that I think is important to note is that I am not in the business of punishing our counties. I'm not in the business of doing that. I don't think we should punish counties or county officials, anything like that, unless they openly do something wrong, like we've seen in Colorado with that other lady. I mean, when you're sneaking in, breaking codes, using people's security passes, I mean, you're clearly breaking the law. Okay, that's ridiculous. But as we saw, that's an issue where you need to address it. However, what I am more concerned about is aligning with best practices. When I see counties that have very few election issues and they are doing things that other counties are not doing, then it makes sense to align those best practices. I do not believe in controlling people or controlling outcomes. I only believe that you are to control the process. I hope you understand better. I hope you have a better understanding of our process. Really want you to always stay unafraid, always stay unapologetic, and never stop seeking the truth. Have a great week.